Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a journey that plunges right into, well, a philosophical abyss, exploring the spiritual landscape of a true titan of world literature, Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky is one of those writers whose work just immediately confronts you. I mean, it forces you to face the most profound questions of existence, guilt, psychological torment, the search for redemption, and, above all, faith.
Yeah, his novels aren't just stories. They feel more like intense, often agonizing psychological battlegrounds.
They really are.
Absolutely. And when you talk about Dostoevsky, you conjure these images of Raskolnikov's axe or the chaos of the Karamazov family, the tortured soul. But here's the central mystery we really want to dive into today. Was Dostoevsky truly religious?
It's a huge question.
It is. What exactly did he believe, especially given that the doubt and the darkness he writes about feel so terrifyingly real?
And that is the compelling paradox, isn't it? He is, on the one hand, widely considered one of the greatest Christian theologians in literary history.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he is quoted, studied, and just revered by atheists, nihilists, and skeptics. And the reason is that he gave the arguments against God their most powerful, most articulate voice ever.
So he wasn't writing, like, pamphlets for believers. He was staging a comprehensive philosophical debate where belief and doubt are locked in this mortal combat.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to trace his actual life path, because his faith wasn't some quiet intellectual thing. It wasn't adherence to dogma. It was forged in crisis.
In a crucible of near death, and in the physical, lived reality of suffering.
That's the core of it. We're going to explore how he moved from a childhood faith through revolutionary doubt and into this fiercely personal, almost existential form of Christianity.
It's the story of a man who looked straight into the abyss, who questioned the very foundation of existence, and still made this radical, chosen decision to believe. We're looking at how he built one of the richest, most complex spiritual structures in all of fiction.
So to really grasp the spiritual intensity Dostoevsky puts into his characters, you have to understand the ground he came from, the contradictions. He was born in 1821 in Moscow, but it's where in Moscow that tells you almost everything.
Yes, the location of his birth is so key. He was born on the grounds of a public hospital for the poor, and that environment was contradictory from day one.
How so?
Well, his family lived there because his father was a staff doctor. And this was a man who was strict, often cold, very authoritarian, sometimes even cruel. He represented the harsh, structured, unforgiving part of the world.
But that was balanced, wasn't it? There's another influence.
Completely balanced by his mother. She was the spiritual and emotional anchor of the family. She was gentle, warm, and deeply, deeply immersed in the Russian Orthodox tradition.
So you have this crucial duality right in his psyche from the start.
Right there from childhood.
Yeah.
The cold, brutal facts of human length and suffering, and then this warm, embracing possibility of faith and love.
And his mother gave him something tangible, an object that really symbolizes that spiritual grounding, something he carried with him through decades of turmoil.
That small, simple children's Bible. And it sounds like this lovely, almost sentimental anecdote, but you really can't overstate its significance.
He kept it his whole life.
For decades, he carried that specific copy with him, even when he was imprisoned, stripped of all his other possessions, in a Siberian labor camp. It was his anchor. A direct physical link back to the warmth and the compassion, the innocence of his mother, and that early faith.
So his early worldview is just steeped in this collision of opposites. You have the comforting rituals of the Orthodox Church, the stories of saints and martyrs.
And on the other side, the constant, brutal reality of human suffering he saw every single day. The sick, the dying, the poor, right outside his window in the hospital ground.
A mixture. It became his language.
It became his native emotional language. Tenderness and brutality, poverty and piety. He was described as having a sensitivity that was almost mystical, quick to sympathize, quick to weep. He just felt everything so deeply.
And he said himself that these memories formed the basis for everything.
His entire worldview. For him, faith wasn't academic. It wasn't an idea. It was embodied. It was inextricably tied to human dignity, to suffering, and to compassionate love.
But then that foundation, it fractured. What was the catalyst? What brought on the birth of doubt?
It was a series of tragedies in his late teenage years. First, his mother died of tuberculosis, and that just shattered the family dynamic.
And then he was sent away.
He was sent to military engineering school in St. Petersburg, a place he absolutely hated. It was all about cold, rational calculation, the exact opposite of his artistic spiritual passion.
And St. Petersburg was a world away from his Moscow childhood, intellectually speaking.
A completely different universe. It was the Russian gateway to all the intellectual trends sweeping across Europe at the time.
So this is where he encounters the big, unstoppable wave of Western thought.
Head on. Rationalism, utopian socialism, the Enlightenment skepticism, this burgeoning humanism. He just devoured the forbidden works of Voltaire, Rousseau, Goethe, French utopian writers like George Sand.
And these were thinkers who were essentially replacing God with man, right? They were elevating human reason as the sole source of morality and progress.
They were, and for Dostoevsky, this intellectual assault, it didn't lead to a total rejection of God, not at first. It led to a profound, immediate spiritual crisis.
The rational arguments just pressed so hard against his emotional childhood faith.
They asked unbearable questions. If man is fundamentally good and rational, as these thinkers claimed, then why is the world so full of senseless suffering?
This is the moment. This is where he starts asking the foundational questions that are going to define his entire literary career. It's not just if God exists, but how a just God can allow the world to be the way it is.
Precisely. This is the fracture point. Why do innocent children die? Why does suffering seem so random, so unjust? And then the reverse challenge. If God doesn't exist, if morality is just relative, what holds society together? What stops us from doing terrible things?
So his faith became unstable.
Wounded. And relentlessly restless. He refused to abandon the possibility of faith, but he could no longer accept it uncritically or passively. He was now seeking an answer, not just an affirmation.
So this path from a restless kind of doubt to a radical experiential certainty, it really kicks off in 1849. He joins a discussion group, the Petrushevsky Circle.
Right, and the circle was basically a collection of intellectual liberals, mostly young writers, thinkers. They read banned books, they criticized the cruelty of the Tsarist regime, and they talked about political reform, utopian ideas.
They were mostly just talking.
Mostly. But in the paranoid eyes of Tsar Nicholas I, this was a revolutionary conspiracy.
And the crackdown was swift and terrifying.
Dostoevsky was arrested along with the others and thrown into this freezing fortress prison for months. The psychological torment was intense, but it was nothing compared to the climax they staged in December of 1849, the mock execution.
This event, it might be the single most important moment in Dostoevsky's spiritual life. You have to help us understand the staging of this psychological torture.
It was meticulously orchestrated to feel utterly real. I mean, to push these men to the absolute brink of death. They were taken out to a public square, Semenovsky Square, in freezing temperatures.
And he's in the first group.
He was. They were tied to execution stakes. Guards covered their heads with hoods. The firing squad raised their muskets, pointed them directly at the prisoners' chests, and the atmosphere was just deafening. The booming of the execution drones was specifically designed to drown out all rational thought.
To force them into a primal state.
Exactly, a pre-intellectual state.
And Dostoevsky, standing there, he believes he has just seconds left to live. What did he say about that moment? About that internal experience of facing the absolute end?
He described it as a sudden, overwhelming, almost ecstatic sensation. The philosophical arguments, the utopian schemes, the rationalist doubts, all of it just evaporated instantly.
And what was left?
All that remained was an incandescent love for life itself. He wrote about seeing the sacred, overlooked beauty in the simplest things. The color of the sky, the faces of the people around him, the simple, unbelievable fact of being.
It's like it stripped away all the philosophical abstraction he'd been living in.
Completely. Life, he realized, was not a debate. It was a sacred gift. He saw that he'd been overlooking the immeasurable value of existence while he was brooding over these intellectual puzzles back in St. Petersburg.
He made a promise to himself.
He did. He promised himself that if he lived, he would live every moment fully, count every single second as sacred.
And then the ultimate psychological shock.
The guns don't fire. No. A messenger gallops into the square, waving a white handkerchief. A reprieve from the Tsar. Their sentences were commuted to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by years of enforced military service. The emotional whiplash is just unimaginable.
He wrote later, "I was reborn into a new life." What was the lasting spiritual impact of that earthquake?
The effect was permanent. It redefined his faith entirely. It proved experientially that theory was irrelevant. Life is sacred. And suffering, when you face it as a concrete reality, it carries profound meaning.
So his faith could never be based on abstract arguments again.
Never. Or on dogma. It had to be a raw, lived experience, a recognition of the immediate miraculous nature of existence, even when that existence is painful. The question of whether God exists became, in that moment, less important than the reality of human love and human suffering, which he had just faced down.
That's a really powerful point. But just to pause on that for a second, he was wrestling intellectually with God, but the mock execution pushed him past that intellectual border into a realm of pure feeling, instinct. How did that specifically change his writing?
It made his writing fundamentally visceral. Before this, his work was psychological, but in a more conventional sense. After, the psychology becomes existential. His characters are always wrestling not just with ideas, but with the feeling of life or death hanging in the balance.
The stakes are always ultimate.
Always. The value of life in his novels is measured by how close one has come to losing it. Every argument in his later work is delivered as if the character is standing right there, in front of a firing squad.
So the mock execution was the spiritual revelation. But Siberia, the penal labor camp in Omsk, that was the 4-year practical test of that revelation. This wasn't a fleeting moment of terror. This was brutal, continuous suffering.
Omsk was the harshest imaginable environment. Dostoevsky, this educated intellectual, was thrown into freezing barracks to live shoulder to shoulder with murderers, thieves, violent offenders, the Nera, the Russian common people, but in their most broken, degraded form.
And he was stripped of everything.
Completely. No intellectual comforts, no privacy, no pen, no paper, no silence.
He was totally cut off from all those Western ideas and rationalist books he'd been embracing. But he had one book.
Yes, the New Testament. The very same one his mother had given him, now this worn, beloved possession. He read it until the pages were thin and soft, until he had it completely memorized.
So this was an enforced, total immersion.
It was, stripped of all other intellectual stimulus. His entire focus was just redirected onto the figure of Christ and the simple, radical message of the Gospels.
And what was the revolutionary insight he found? Not just in the text, but in the community of hardened criminals all around him.
He discovered something his liberal, utopian friends back in St. Petersburg would never have acknowledged. Genuine human dignity, kindness, and tenderness existing even among the supposedly irredeemable.
These were men society here just cast off.
As absolute dregs. Yet Dostoevsky witnessed moments of profound spiritual grace, of self-sacrifice, of deep feeling among them.
So he had arrived thinking of the poor as this abstract concept, victims to be rescued by socialism. He left seeing them as complex individuals, each possessing a soul.
Precisely. His famous realization from that time was, there is no such thing as a completely bad person. Even in the most hardened soul, a spark of God remains.
And that just completely contradicted the rationalist view.
It did. The view that crime was just a function of a bad environment or poor social policy. Dostoevsky realized that the potential for both good and evil exists in every human heart, regardless of education or status.
So how did that shift his entire philosophical understanding of salvation?
It became the bedrock of his spiritual philosophy. Salvation is internal, and it's relational. People are not saved by political systems, or by institutional rules, or by intellectual genius. They are saved by compassion, by suffering, and by love shown between one human being and another.
So his time in Siberia, it just stripped away the intellectual arrogance of that St. Petersburg era.
Completely. He entered the camp a skeptic, grounded in Western theory. He left a believer whose conviction was grounded in the absolute first-hand understanding of human brokenness and the possibility of unexpected spiritual grace.
A transition from the abstract to the concrete.
Exactly that. He learned that you don't need to analyze the perfect mechanism of society to find truth. You just need to look into the eyes of a suffering neighbor. That immediate relational truth became his ultimate authority.
Now, it is essential to stress that the faith Dostoevsky emerged with was, well, it was fundamentally unconventional. He did not become some simple institutional devotee.
No, not at all. He maintained a strong loyalty to Russian Orthodoxy as a cultural and spiritual home, but he was deeply critical of religious bureaucracy, of hypocrisy, of rigidity. His faith was a spiritual path built for the individual, not for the institution.
Okay, let's try to define the 3 specific pillars of this intensely personal belief system. Let's start with the heart of his devotion.
Pillar 1 would be a deep devotion to Christ, not to the church. For Dostoevsky, the physical figure of Christ, specifically the Christ who suffered unjustly, who was humble, and who loved unconditionally, that was the highest ideal humanity could possibly conceive.
He was freedom, forgiveness.
In absolute solidarity with the poor and broken.
So he saw Christ as this radical revolutionary of love, and he often contrasted that with the earthly institution that, bore his name.
Absolutely. The institution, in his view, often sought power and temporal security. Christ sought the internal freedom of the soul. Dostoevsky's faith was focused on imitating that ideal of compassionate suffering and love, no matter how impractical or impossible it might seem in the modern world.
And the second pillar, this connects directly back to his physical experience, faith through suffering.
Pillar 2, faith through suffering. Now, this is often the most controversial part of his theology. He came to believe that suffering wasn't just an accident to be eliminated, but a necessary spiritual cleanser.
How so?
Because it purifies the soul. It's the only force powerful enough to break the ego. The ego is what drives that rationalist pride, that intellectual arrogance, that desire to be a superman. Suffering forces humility and opens the heart to genuine compassion for others.
But I have to challenge that, based on what we've already looked at. How does Dostoevsky reconcile this idea of purifying suffering with the horrendous, seemingly random suffering of the innocent, particularly children? I mean, that's the very issue that fractured his faith in the first place. Isn't that a dangerous justification?
And that is the precise intellectual trap that Dostoevsky lays for you, the reader. He doesn't offer a clean theological justification for why innocent suffering exists.
He just presents it?
He presents it as a stark, unbearable reality, most famously through Ivan Karamazov. His answer isn't intellectual, it's experiential. He argues that the only way to respond to that unbearable reality is through an act of radical, compassionate love, the Christ ideal. It's not about explaining the suffering away, it's about responding to it with self-sacrifice.
That's a crucial distinction. A response, not an explanation. Which brings us to the third pillar. And this is maybe the most modern and relatable part of his faith.
Pillar 3. Faith balanced with doubt. Dostoevsky understood that a faith that hasn't wrestled with its own contradictions is weak. His famous phrase was that his hosanna, his faith, was born in a furnace of doubt.
He consciously gives the strongest possible arguments to his atheist characters.
He has to. He ensures that when his characters choose belief, they are choosing it fully aware of the costs, fully aware of the intellectual paradoxes involved.
So doubt isn't the enemy of faith, it's the proving ground. It deepens the commitment.
It makes the commitment an active choice, a fierce personal act of will rather than just a passive inheritance. And that, right there, is the definition of existential faith. You choose, you act, and you take responsibility for that belief, even if logic cannot entirely support it.
Okay, let's unpack this further then. To truly understand this unique, battle-tested faith, this combination of Christ, suffering, and doubt, we have to see how he built these ideas into the actual architecture of his major works. This is where he goes beyond biography and becomes a spiritual architect for the modern age. All right, this is the deep dive into the 4 colossal novels that really define Dostoevsky's spiritual universe. Let's start with Crime and Punishment, his exploration of sin, guilt, and the path to redemption.
Crime and Punishment from 1866 is Dostoevsky's direct assault on the radical rationalism he had encountered back in St. Petersburg. The protagonist, Raskolnikov, is this impoverished student who is intellectually brilliant but spiritually completely isolated.
And his central philosophical mistake is the development of this Superman theory. Can you walk us through the reasoning that leads him to murder?
Well, Raskolnikov rationalizes that ordinary men have to obey moral law, but that extraordinary men, the Napoleons, the world changers, they have the right, even the duty, to transcend that law if it leads to a greater good.
So he sees the pawnbroker as just a useless parasite.
Exactly. He argues that by killing her, he can steal her money, fund his education, do all these good works, and thereby prove his own greatness. This is the absolute height of intellectual arrogance. It's utilitarian philosophy applied disastrously.
He substitutes the moral authority of God with his own intellect. But the book isn't really about the act itself, it's about the immediate psychological fallout.
That's right. The philosophical sin leads immediately to psychological hell. Raskolnikov is not pursued by the police. He's pursued by his own conscience. He's consumed by paranoia, guilt, self-hatred, and this terrible, feverish isolation.
He tried to put himself above humanity, but his soul drags him down.
The fundamental spiritual reality of his soul just drags him down into an abyss of suffering. The punishment is immediate, it's internal, and it is far, far worse than any prison sentence.
And against this brilliant, tormented rationalist, Dostoevsky introduces the moral center of the novel, Sonia Marmeladov.
Sonia is the necessary counterpoint. She has been forced into the degradation of prostitution to support her starving family, yet she remains spiritually completely untouched. She's the embodiment of humility, compassion, and true Christian virtue.
She suffers without making others suffer.
She never loses her capacity for empathy or self-sacrifice.
She represents the path of Christ then, accepting suffering and transforming it through love. So how does she actually achieve Raskolnikov's salvation?
The path to salvation is profoundly personal and relational. Raskolnikov can't save himself through his own thoughts or a simple confession. He is saved by Sonia's selfless love.
The famous scene where she reads to him.
Exactly. She reads him the story of Lazarus, the resurrection of the dead. It's Dostoevsky's symbolic mechanism. Sonia, through her pure, wounded faith and her empathy, resurrects Raskolnikov's deadened, intellectually isolated soul.
So the key message is that redemption isn't abstract or institutional. It happens only through mutual human connection, through confession and shared humility.
It's the Siberian lesson writ large. Broken people save broken people. Raskolnikov only finds his humanity and the possibility of a spiritual life when he finally confesses and accepts the shared cross of humanity, which is symbolized by the New Testament that Sonia gives him.
Okay, so moving from the self-proclaimed Superman, Dostoevsky then explored the complete opposite end of the spectrum in The Idiot in 1868. This is the great thought experiment with Prince Myshkin.
Myshkin is Dostoevsky's attempt to depict a truly beautiful soul, a completely good man. He's innocent, selfless, trusting, totally forgiving, and he's dropped into the corrupt, calculating, ambitious society of 19th century St. Petersburg.
He's the closest thing Dostoevsky ever came to depicting Christ in the modern world.
A Christ figure, absolutely. But the tragedy of the novel is that this pure goodness, it's not celebrated. It becomes destructive.
Right. Society destroys him because of his pure qualities.
Precisely. Myshkin fails, and he fails catastrophically. He's misunderstood, he's abused, he's mocked, and he's ultimately driven back into his illness, his idiocy. The world cannot tolerate absolute, pure Christian love.
Why not?
Because that kind of love demands genuine moral accountability and selflessness, which society driven by pride, lust, and greed simply refuses to give.
So The Idiot is this devastating critique, arguing that society rejects Christ not because it doesn't understand him, but because it actually prefers its own brokenness.
It shows that people often claim to want morality and goodness, but when they're faced with genuine, radical purity, they recoil. The presence of Myshkin exposes the spiritual sickness of everyone around him. It triggers their worst passions, their jealousies, and ultimately leads to violence and destruction.
It suggests that in a fallen world, perfect purity just can't survive intact.
It can't.
Okay, so if The Idiot was about the failure of individual goodness, Demons from 1872 shifts the focus to the failure of a whole society when it abandons its spiritual roots.
Right.
This novel is considered prophetic.
It is Dostoevsky's most fiercely political spiritual novel. He saw this vacuum being created by the collapse of traditional faith and moral consensus. And he argued that when a society abandons its spiritual core, it doesn't just become neutral. It rushes immediately to replace that core with something else.
And in the novel, that replacement is ideology, specifically utopian socialism and radical nihilism.
Yes. Nihilism, in Dostoevsky's terms, is the philosophical belief that life is without objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic moral value. It's the denial of absolute truth. And Demons shows that once God is removed from the equation, the radicals just substitute him with ideology or nationalism or the promise of some perfect future.
The terrifying implication he draws is that a truly atheistic revolution can't just be political, it has to be destructive. Because the only way to establish a new moral order is to destroy the old one.
Including human freedom. The novel is filled with these violent, cold, calculating characters, the demons, who use rational logic to justify mass murder and political tyranny.
They believe they're so intellectually advanced that human life becomes disposable.
It's disposable in service of their grand future ideal. Demons is maybe one of the earliest literary warnings that utopian dreams, when they're grounded solely in rationalism and stripped of spiritual compassion, they inevitably become totalitarian nightmares.
And now we arrive at the summit of Dostoevsky's religious and philosophical thought, The Brothers Karamazov from 1880. This novel is the final summation of his lifelong struggle between faith and doubt.
It really is. It's structured as this massive moral universe contained within one single family. The three brothers symbolize the competing forces within the human soul.
Right. You have Dmitri,
Who represents raw passion, instinct, earthly appetite. Then Ivan, who is cold reason, doubt, and intellectual rebellion. And finally, Alyosha, who represents active faith, compassion, and spiritual striving.
And their father, Fyodor Pavlovich. He's this grotesque symbol of broken, unredeemed humanity that sets the whole tragedy in motion.
Exactly. He is corruption, lust, and utter selfishness. He embodies the sheer brokenness that the Karamazov bloodline must either accept or transcend. The entire novel is a massive spiritual court case over his murder, but the real question is, can the soul be redeemed, or is it just condemned by its nature?
The spiritual conflict reaches its terrifying peak through Ivan, and Dostoevsky gives Ivan the strongest arguments against belief he could possibly conceive. Let's dive into Ivan's great challenge: rebellion.
Ivan doesn't reject God's power or his existence. He rejects the world that God created, and he meticulously lays out these horrific, real-world examples of suffering, specifically the suffering of innocent children, to make his case. He details things like a general setting his dogs on a small child just because the child threw a stone.
He confronts the idea of an ultimate harmony directly. He argues that no future heaven could ever justify the present concrete torture of a single innocent human being.
That is the core challenge. The famous line is, "If the price of eternal harmony is the suffering of one child, I return my ticket to heaven." Ivan sees the cost as too high, and by presenting this argument so powerfully, Dostoevsky forces you, the reader, to confront the ethical and moral difficulty of belief head-on.
If God exists, why this? And Ivan refuses to accept any answer that involves some kind of transcendent logic.
He won't have it.
But Ivan also authors the parable that immediately follows this, which shifts the focus from God's justice to the nature of institutional belief, the Grand Inquisitor.
This is one of the most brilliant and devastating parables in all of literature. Christ returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition and is immediately arrested by the powerful elderly cardinal, the Grand Inquisitor.
And the Inquisitor's argument is stunningly pragmatic. He claims Christ made a huge mistake by granting humanity freedom.
The Inquisitor says that Christ overestimated humanity. He argues that the masses don't want the burden of spiritual freedom. They want three things that Christ refused to give them during the temptations in the desert: miracle, which is certainty or bread; mystery, something to bow down to; and authority, someone to tell them what to do.
And the core line just encapsulates the entire critique of human nature.
People do not want freedom. They want bread and authority. You gave them freedom, and freedom is too heavy for them. The Inquisitor claims that the Church has corrected Christ's error by providing security, miracles, and certainty, taking the unbearable burden of free moral choice off their shoulders.
So this is Dostoevsky's final, devastating critique of institutional religion.
It is. That it often prefers the comfort of control and power over the terrifying, radical message of individual compassion and freedom that's embodied by Christ. The entire novel, through Ivan's double challenge, forces the reader into an act of choosing faith despite the overwhelming weight of the argument against it. You have to choose the compassionate ideal of Alyosha and Christ, knowing the full force of Ivan's logic.
The choice, for Dostoevsky, isn't made by the mind.
No, it's made by the heart's commitment to love.
We have traced Dostoevsky's journey from theoretical doubt through the fire of the mock execution, the practical lessons of Siberia, and culminating in these epic novels. So let's synthesize his final, challenging conclusion about suffering.
His conclusion remained firm to the end. Suffering is necessary for spiritual truth. Not suffering that's inflicted arbitrarily, but suffering that successfully breaks the ego and the intellectual pride that makes us believe we can be our own gods.
And he lived this truth continuously. I mean, chronic epilepsy, the terror of poverty, the constant fear of political backlash, the devastating loss of his children, his crippling gambling addiction. His philosophy wasn't academic.
No, it was existential self-justification. He channeled that lifelong pain directly into his worldview. He believed that suffering reveals truth because it strips away all of life's comfortable, insulating illusions.
So the comfortable, the rationalists, are blind.
They're blind. It is the broken, the humble, the marginalized, the characters who have hit the absolute bottom, who are finally capable of seeing genuine spiritual reality and possessing true compassion.
So we circle back to the central mystery we started with. What is the complicated answer to the question? Was Dostoevsky truly religious?
The answer is yes, but his religion was not tidy or conventional or comfortable. He was a constant doubter. His faith was a struggle, maintained through sheer will. He was not a saint. He was a passionate, tormented, and deeply human seeker.
But what were his unwavering beliefs, the ones that survived that furnace of doubt?
He believed absolutely in Christ as the highest moral ideal. He believed in the inherent dignity of every single human being, regardless of their crime or their status. He believed compassion was the highest virtue, and that love, radical, self-sacrificing love, was the only real path to redemption. And the soul, he insisted, was real, and it was a central battleground for our existence.
This devotion is really summarized in that staggering statement from his levels that you mentioned earlier.
It is the ultimate declaration of existential Christianity, he wrote. If someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth, I would choose to remain with Christ rather than with the truth.
That is a staggering position to take. It's not about logic or historical evidence or theological proof. It's an ultimate act of devotion to the moral ideal, chosen over intellectual certainty.
It's a recognition. For Dostoevsky, the ideal of Christ's unconditional love and forgiveness is the only concept that prevents humanity from collapsing into nihilism and self-destruction. He makes a non-rational existential leap of faith because he realizes the rational, humanist alternative leads to Ivan's despair and Raskolnikov's isolation.
It's no wonder, then, that he influenced nearly every major thinker who came after him, particularly those who focused on the human condition in the 20th century.
His legacy is massive because he diagnosed the spiritual crisis of modernity before it even fully manifested. Nietzsche, the great challenger of Christian morality, called Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom he ever learned anything, and yet he also confessed to fearing him.
Albert Camus called him a prophet of the modern age.
He did, because Dostoevsky understood the vacuum that would be left by the collapse of faith. Freud studied him as a psychological genius who understood guilt and patricide better than anyone. And thinkers like Kierkegaard, who were obsessed with faith and despair and the individual, they found a kindred spirit in Dostoevsky.
So he is the forerunner of existential Christianity.
And a key figure in modern existentialism, full stop. His characters are still alive in our culture because they grapple with the universal, inescapable questions. What is the true cost of freedom? Is life inherently meaningless? Can love truly redeem the broken parts of the human spirit?
His novels offer no easy comfort. They are powerful, agonizing invitations to wrestle with the foundational spiritual questions of human existence. Hashtag outro. This has been a profound journey through the spiritual formation of Fyodor Dostoevsky. We've traced his path from a child's faith, anchored by a simple New Testament, through the desert of doubt, facing literal death on the firing line, and suffering those purifying years in Siberia.
His final faith was neither naive, nor institutional, nor dogmatic. It was existential, a fierce personal commitment born directly from life, from suffering, and from a desperate, unwavering love for humanity. It was the religion of compassion, humility, forgiveness, and inner freedom, demanding that the individual face their own soul in all its complexity.
He left behind a spiritual landscape that is terrifyingly honest and utterly necessary for understanding the spiritual and political conditions of the modern world.
And that enduring message he built out of his darkest moments, a message lived by Sonia, spoken by Alyosha, and argued fiercely against by Ivan, is this. Dostoevsky believed that the salvation of the world, whether it's political or spiritual, begins in the heart of one single person. It is achieved through a single act of love, a single moment of profound understanding, or a single spark of compassion for a fellow broken human being. This is the greatest religious idea he ever